They did not steal anything. They did not break the cabin. They dragged a retired K9 into the snow, hung him from a pine tree, and beat him until the forest went silent. At dawn, he was still there, barely breathing, one eye swollen shut, still facing the road. He was 10 years old, a retired K9 named Shadow, left behind while his owner was away. 2 days earlier, this mountain was quiet. A 68-year-old veteran, a loyal dog guarding an empty cabin. A man had come with an offer. The answer was no. Now the rope was tight. The message was carved deep. I stayed, I waited, I did my job. And when the owner returned, the mountain stopped pretending nothing had happened. Before we begin, remember to like, share, and subscribe. Where are you watching from today, and how does this story make you feel? Snow pressed down on the Montana ridgeline without falling. It did not drift or swirl or soften the edges of the world. It simply stayed there, heavy and unmoving, as if the mountain itself were holding its breath. Light filtered through a sky the color of old steel, flattening shadows and dulling distance until everything felt closer than it should have been. The forest stood quiet, not peaceful, but attentive. The road gave up long before the cabin did. It narrowed from pavement to gravel, then to packed snow scored by old tire tracks that had frozen into place, and finally ended in a clearing that looked less like a destination and more like a decision. The cabin sat there alone, timber darkened by years of wind and cold, roof bowed slightly under winter's weight, windows catching just enough light to suggest someone still cared enough to keep them clear. Smoke lifted faintly from the chimney, thin and deliberate, rising straight into the air as if even the fire knew better than to draw attention to itself. Jonas Hale lived there, alone. He moved across the porch with measured steps, the kind that came from a body trained to account for uneven ground, long before it learned the word caution. At 68, he was still tall, still broad across the shoulders, still carrying himself with a straightness that did not come from pride, but from habit. The cold did not hurry him. It never had. His breath fogged once, then steadied, and his gloved hands adjusted a loose board near the door with the quiet care of someone who fixed things because leaving them broken felt wrong. The olive M1965 field jacket hung heavy on his frame, creased at the elbows, worn thin at the cuffs, its fabric holding the memory of other winters. A small U.S. Army patch sat above the left breast pocket, faded but intact, and the American flag rested on the shoulder, stitched flat and firm. They were not displayed. They were carried, not as statements, but as facts that had survived everything else. Shadow lay at Jonas's feet, half on the porch boards, half on the packed snow. He did not sleep. The German shepherd's body was still, long lines folded into a posture that looked relaxed only to those who did not know better. His coat was dark sable, black along the spine, lighter at the flanks, scarred in places where fur grew just a shade thinner. His ears stayed upright, angled slightly apart, catching sound the way a compass caught direction. His eyes were open, amber and steady, tracking not movement but absence, measuring the quiet for anything that did not belong. A retired K9 never truly rested. He settled the way a sentry did when the watch officially ended, but the habit refused to follow orders. Jonas paused beside him, letting his gloved fingers rest briefly against the thick fur at Shadow's neck. It was not a command, not reassurance, just contact, given and received without ceremony. Shadow did not look up. He did not need to. The connection was already there, steady and unspoken. This place asked nothing of Jonas Hale. That was why he had chosen it. There were no neighbors to wave from driveways, no town meetings, no one curious enough to wonder why an old soldier had come to the mountains instead of settling somewhere warmer, easier, more forgiving. Here, no one expected explanations. No one needed him to be strong or brave or useful. The land did not care who he had been. It only responded to what he did now, day by day, in small, practical ways. The sound of an engine broke the afternoon stillness with a note that felt out of tune. Shadow's ears shifted first. His head followed a second later, eyes narrowing as he focused down the tree-lined approach where the road bent just enough to hide what came next. Jonas straightened slowly, not alarmed, but attentive. his posture changing in a way that belonged to another life, one where unexpected sounds carried weight. The pickup truck emerged from the trees cleanly, its dark paint unblemished by mud or salt, its tires cutting new lines into snow that had not yet learned to expect visitors. It rolled forward at an unhurried pace, stopping well short of the porch, engine idling with a smoothness that felt practiced, too careful, too controlled. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out who did not fit the landscape. Caleb Rourke wore boots that had never known frozen ground long enough to remember it. His coat was tailored, dark wool brushed clean, collar turned up more for effect than warmth. He moved with an easy confidence, shoulders loose, hands relaxed at his sides, the kind of man who believed space would make room for him because it always had. His smile arrived before he did, measured and ready, carrying just enough warmth to feel intentional. Jonas did not move to meet him. Rourke took in the cabin with a glance that lingered on the roofline, the windows, the cleared path through the snow, the stacked firewood tucked neatly under an overhang. His eyes did not miss much. They flicked once to Shadow, paused there for the briefest moment, then returned to Jonas with renewed interest. He spoke of development, of opportunity, of how land like this was becoming valuable as people looked for quiet places that could still be shaped into something profitable. His voice carried easily in the cold air, smooth and even, as if rehearsed against resistance. He mentioned infrastructure, future roads, the kind of progress that arrived whether people welcomed it or not. Jonas listened without interruption. His face did not change. The wind moved faintly through the trees behind him, stirring snow from branches in soft, whispering falls that landed soundlessly at Shadow's paws. When Rourke finished, Jonas said nothing. Silence stretched, thin at first, then taut. The smile on Rourke's face tightened at the edges, losing some of its ease. His gaze drifted again, this time settling on Shadow with a fraction more weight, as if committing the animal to memory. The dog did not react. He remained still, eyes fixed forward, body aligned with the porch, a presence that did not threaten but did not retreat. Rourke nodded once, as if acknowledging a detail that would matter later. He spoke again, lightly, about how change favored those who adapted early, about how holding on too tightly to old ground sometimes made people miss their chance. Jonas remained where he was. The truck door closed with a soft, solid sound. The engine revved once, then eased back into motion, tires compressing snow, retreating along the same narrow path it had arrived on. The vehicle disappeared into the trees without haste, leaving behind fresh tracks that cut too cleanly through the white. The cold stayed. Jonas stood for a moment longer, watching the place where the road bent out of sight. His breath fogged, then steadied again. Shadow shifted his weight slightly, muscles tightening and releasing beneath his coat, ears still high. The forest settled, but it did not forget. As evening approached, the light thinned, draining color from the snow and leaving the world washed in pale blue and gray. The wind changed direction, subtle enough that only those who listened noticed. It carried with it the faintest scent of oil, of metal, of something that did not belong to pine and frozen earth. Jonas closed the cabin door as night gathered its edges. Inside, the fire crackled low, its warmth pushing back against the cold in careful increments. Shadow repositioned himself near the hearth, not close enough to sleep, not far enough to disengage. His eyes tracked the dark window, following reflections that were not reflections at all. Somewhere beyond the tree line, something listened, and the land, patient and enduring, waited to see what would come for it next. Morning came without warmth. The light over the Montana ridge was pale and thin, spreading slowly across the snow as if unsure whether it was welcome. Jonas Hale moved through the cabin with the quiet economy of someone who packed often but never lightly, checking each corner once, then once more, not because he forgot, but because habit demanded certainty. Winter supplies were stacked by the door, fuel cans sealed tight, food measured by days rather than comfort. The work would take 2 nights, maybe 3 if the roads turned. The numbers were clean, the decision was not. Shadow followed him from room to room without sound. The German shepherd's steps were soft, controlled, his body loose but attentive, eyes tracking Jonas instead of the windows. He knew this rhythm. He knew the difference between preparation and departure. When Jonas pulled on his gloves, Shadow stopped moving altogether, head lifting just enough to meet him where he stood. Outside, the cold pressed close. Snow creaked faintly beneath Jonas's boots as he knelt, the motion slow, deliberate, like a man lowering himself into something sacred. He rested his forehead gently against Shadow's, breath fogging between them for a brief moment before fading. The dog did not shift. His ears stayed upright, angled forward, catching the distant hush of the forest waking to another day. No words passed between them. None were needed, none were wasted. Jonas stood, turned, and walked to the truck without looking back. The engine caught, low and steady, and the vehicle eased forward, tires finding the tracks left from the day before. Shadow remained where he was, planted at the edge of the clearing, watching until the shape of the truck dissolved into white and distance. Only then did he move, repositioning himself closer to the porch, body aligned with the door, eyes never leaving the road. By late afternoon, the mountain began to change its voice. The wind shifted first, subtle but wrong, bringing with it a stillness that pressed inward instead of spreading out. The birds fell silent, one by one, their absence more noticeable than their song had been. Snow softened under a low haze that crept between the trees, swallowing sound and depth until the forest felt closer, tighter, as if the space itself were being folded inward. Shadow rose. His posture changed, spine straightening, weight shifting forward, muscles engaging beneath his dark sable coat. He moved to the edge of the porch, then stepped off into the snow, placing himself squarely between the cabin and the tree line. His tail remained still. His breathing slowed. This was not fear. It was recognition. Shapes moved where there should have been none. 3 figures emerged between the trunks, their outlines broken by drifting snow and shadow, their movements careful and unhurried. They did not stumble. They did not speak. Their boots pressed into the snow with controlled pressure, each step placed as if already practiced. Shadow watched them without sound, head level, ears high, body held in a calm that did not invite approach and did not allow retreat. One of them shifted to the side. Shadow adjusted, mirroring the movement, maintaining his position without advancing. He did not bark. He did not charge. He simply existed, a solid line drawn across the clearing. The rope came from the left. It flew fast, low, catching Shadow around the shoulder and neck before instinct could complete its arc. His body reacted at once, twisting hard, paws digging into the snow as he fought to regain footing. There was no yelp, no panic, only the sound of breath forced from lungs as weight came down on him from behind. Hands gripped fur and muscle with practiced efficiency, forcing him backward toward the trees. "Hold!" a voice said, sharp and clipped. Shadow struggled in silence, legs churning, nails tearing at packed snow and frozen earth, but there were too many of them, and they knew exactly where to stand. They hauled him to a thick pine just beyond the edge of the clearing, its lower limbs heavy with snow, trunk-scarred from old winters. The rope was worked quickly, looped high enough to lift his front paws, low enough to leave him straining, suspended in a position designed not to kill, but to hurt. The first kick landed against his ribs with a dull, final sound that echoed once and disappeared. Another followed, then another, boots striking flesh and bone in a rhythm that felt measured rather than wild. Shadow's body tightened, muscles burning, breath coming in sharp pulls as he fought to stay upright. He did not cry out. His eyes stayed open, fixed on the cabin, on the dark doorway where Jonas should have been. Snow fell from the branches above as one of the men stepped closer. He pulled a knife from his pocket, its blade catching a faint glint of dying light. The pine's bark resisted at first, then gave way under steady pressure, pale wood exposed in clean lines. Each stroke was deliberate, the sound of steel against wood harsh in the muffled quiet of the forest. Blood darkened the snow beneath Shadow, soaking in without judgment. The cold crept into his limbs, numbing edges while pain pulsed deep and slow. When his body sagged, when the strain became too much to hold, the blows stopped. The rope remained. The message was complete. They stepped back, breathing controlled, movements unhurried. One of them glanced at Shadow, head tilting slightly as if assessing a finished task. "Leave him," another voice said, low and certain. Engines started somewhere beyond the trees, distant and brief. The sound faded, swallowed by snow and distance, leaving the forest to close in on itself once more. The clearing fell quiet again, the kind of quiet that pressed against the ears and made every breath feel loud. Shadow hung there alone. Time stretched strangely. The sky deepened from gray to blue, then to black, stars pricking through gaps in cloud cover as the cold tightened its grip. His breathing grew shallow, each inhale measured, each exhale a careful release. Pain dulled into a heavy throb, then sharpened again as circulation fought to return to limbs held too long in strain. Still, he waited. His ears twitched at every imagined sound, every shift in the wind, every creak of branch under snow's weight. He listened for the engine he knew by heart, for the rhythm of boots that belonged to one man and no other. The cabin remained dark. The road stayed empty. A single thought anchored him, steady and unyielding. Stay. As night wore on, frost gathered along his whiskers, breath freezing in small crystals that clung and fell away. The rope cut deeper with each shift of his weight, burning where fur and skin pressed against it. His eyes remained open, reflecting faint starlight, still facing the direction Jonas had gone. The forest did not intervene, it simply bore witness. Somewhere beyond the ridgeline, the mountains settled, indifferent to suffering and loyalty alike. Snow continued to fall in slow, deliberate flakes, covering tracks, softening edges, erasing everything except what could not be moved. Shadow waited until waiting was all that remained, because the message carved into the tree was never meant for him. The sun broke the horizon without warmth. Light spilled thinly over the Montana ridge, pale and hesitant, sliding across the snow as if it did not want to reveal what the night had kept. Jonas Hale drove the last stretch of road slowly, the truck's engine low, tires crunching softly over frozen tracks that felt older than they should have been. The mountains stood unchanged, but something in the air felt unsettled, like a room entered after an argument had ended. The porch was empty. That alone was wrong. Jonas cut the engine and sat still, hands resting on the wheel, eyes fixed on the space where Shadow should have been. The dog always waited there. Not pacing, not sleeping, just present, body aligned with the door, eyes lifting before the truck came fully into view. The absence pressed into Jonas's chest harder than the cold. He opened the door and stepped out, boots sinking slightly into snow that had been disturbed and then hastily softened again. Shadow. The name carried farther than he expected, breaking against the trees and returning thinner, unfinished. He listened, breath held, waiting for the familiar sound of movement, the controlled shift of weight, the quiet acknowledgement of a partner still on watch. Nothing answered. The cabin remained still, smoke no longer rising from the chimney, the fire long gone cold. Then he heard it. A faint metallic creak, irregular, strained, coming from somewhere behind the cabin where the trees thickened and the light struggled to reach the ground. It was not a sound the forest made on its own. It carried weight. It repeated with a slow, uneven rhythm, as if something were testing its limits. Jonas followed it without thinking. His steps were measured, precise, each foot placed with care as he moved past the cabin's edge and into the trees. The snow there was churned, broken in places, marked by shallow furrows and compressed footprints that did not belong to animals. His breath fogged once, then steadied, senses narrowing to sound and shape, the rest of the world falling away. Time stalled when he saw Shadow. The German shepherd hung from a low pine limb, body slack and angled wrong, fur darkened and stiff where blood had frozen into it. One eye was swollen shut, the other half open, glassy but aware, chest rising in shallow, uneven pulls. The rope cut into his shoulder and neck, holding him in a position designed not to end him, but to keep him there. For a fraction of a second, Jonas's mind refused to name what his eyes were seeing. Then his body moved. The knife was in his hand before grief had time to form. Steel flashed once in the thin light as the blade bit through rope fibers made brittle by cold. The tension released with a sharp snap, and Shadow fell heavy and sudden into Jonas's arms. The impact drove Jonas to his knees, the weight knocking breath from his chest as he caught the dog against him, arms wrapping tight, instinct overriding age and pain. Shadow's body was warm in places, frighteningly cold in others. He sagged, limbs loose, breath hitching as air forced its way back into lungs that had fought too long. Jonas pressed his face into the matted fur at the dog's neck, inhaling the sharp scent of blood and pine sap, and cold. A sound escaped him, low and broken, but it lasted only a moment. Then he steadied. This is not theft, he thought, the realization cutting through shock with cold clarity. Nothing was missing from the cabin, no tools, no supplies, no attempt had been made to enter. This had been done carefully, deliberately, with restraint where restraint served a purpose. This was leverage. Jonas shifted, cradling Shadow more securely, one hand moving with careful precision along ribs, neck, shoulders, checking without hesitation, cataloging damage the way he once cataloged injuries in places far from home. Shadow stirred faintly, a weak sound pushing past his lips, not a cry, but a breath that acknowledged contact. "Stay," Jonas murmured, the word barely more than air. A human canine connection line, given not as a command but as a promise. "I've got you." The drive to the clinic blurred into a tunnel of white and gray. Jonas pushed the truck harder than he should have, gravel spraying as he left the mountain road behind, tires biting into pavement that felt too smooth, too exposed. Shadow lay across the back seat, wrapped in Jonas's jacket, each rise and fall of his chest measured and watched. Jonas did not speak again. His hands stayed steady on the wheel, knuckles pale, jaw set in a line that did not tremble. The clinic sat back from the road, a low building with a faded sign half obscured by snow. Jonas did not bother to shut the door behind him as he carried Shadow inside, boots slipping briefly on tile wet with melting snow. The veterinarian looked up once, took in the scene, and moved without questions, hands already reaching, voice sharp and focused. "Table. Now." An emergency action dialogue, clipped and final. Officer James Miller stood against the far wall, posture relaxed but alert, jacket unzipped, badge visible but unremarked. He did not step forward. He did not crowd the space. His presence filled the room in a quieter way, the way men did when they had learned that watching mattered more than speaking. The vet worked quickly, movements efficient, controlled, assessing damage with a calm that did not soften what she found. Broken ribs, severe bruising, head trauma, blood loss. Her hands were steady, but her eyes hardened as she traced the rope burns, the pattern of injuries too precise to be mistaken. "This wasn't random," she said at last, not looking up. James Miller nodded once. He had known the moment he saw the rope marks, the controlled spacing of injuries, the absence of chaos. Cruelty had worn a mask of purpose here. Outside, snow continued to fall. It drifted past the clinic windows in thick, steady lines, indifferent to pain, endless in its quiet persistence. Jonas stood where he had been told to stand, arms folded tight across his chest, eyes fixed on Shadow's still form as machines beeped softly and hands worked to keep breath moving through damaged lungs. He felt the mountain then, not as a place, but as a presence, looming and patient, watching him from beyond the glass. He had come here to disappear, to live small, to let the past settle into something distant and manageable. He had believed that distance could be protection, that silence could be a shield. Looking at Shadow, battered but alive, Jonas understood the truth with cold precision. He had stopped running. And something had finally found him. James Miller shifted slightly, pushing off the wall just enough to speak, voice low, contained. "We'll handle what we can," he said, an emotional microline offered without promise or flourish. "But it takes time." Jonas did not answer. His eyes remained on the table, on the rise and fall that proved Shadow was still here, still fighting. Time was something the law would need. Time was something Shadow might not have. The machines continued their steady rhythm. The vet's hands did not slow. Snow pressed against the world outside, softening edges, hiding tracks, pretending nothing had happened. Jonas Hale stood in the middle of it all, still and unyielding, the weight of the past settling back onto his shoulders with a familiarity that felt almost like recognition. The law would step in. But not fast enough. Snow did not stop falling when the law arrived. It only softened, turning from sharp flakes into wet weight that pressed against boots and tires, blurring edges and swallowing sound. James Miller moved through the clearing with deliberate calm, jacket zipped against the cold, hands gloved not for warmth but for care. He did not speak of justice. He spoke of sequence, of order, of doing one thing at a time until the ground itself began to answer. The first answers came from the snow. Boot prints crossed the clearing in uneven lines, heavier at the heel, lighter at the toe, the kind left by men who knew how to move quickly without running. James crouched, measuring distance with his eyes, noting how the tracks converged and separated, how none of them hesitated where Shadow had stood. Tire marks cut through the packed snow near the tree line, wide and shallow, their pattern unfamiliar to the road that led to the cabin. He photographed what mattered, careful to frame each detail without disturbing it, the click of the camera small and precise in the quiet. From the clinic, the veterinarian handed him a sealed bag. Inside lay a fleck of dark industrial paint, chipped and sharp-edged, extracted from Shadow's shoulder where it had lodged beneath fur and skin. James held it up to the light, turning it once, then set it aside with a nod. "This stays," he said, an emergency action line delivered softly, without urgency, because urgency would not help here. Jonas watched from a few steps back. He did not ask questions. He did not offer theories. He observed, waited, recorded each movement and choice the way soldiers did when noise could get people killed. His eyes tracked James's hands, the angle of his body, the way he never stood with his back to open space. When the camera lowered, Jonas noted the order in which evidence was bagged and labeled, the patience that refused to rush what needed to last. In town, the reaction came quietly. Doors closed a little more gently than before. Conversations paused when Jonas entered a room, then resumed in lower tones once he passed. People did not stare, but their eyes lingered longer than politeness required, measuring the man who had brought trouble to a place that preferred to stay unnoticed. Snow melted into slush along the roads, boots leaving dark prints that disappeared by morning, as if the town itself were practicing forgetting. James spent his days moving between places that did not want attention, the general store, where a tired bell announced entries and exits without enthusiasm, the small cafe where steam fogged the windows and hands wrapped around mugs for warmth rather than pleasure. He listened more than he spoke, letting names surface on their own, letting patterns reveal themselves through repetition rather than force. That was how the woman on the ridge finally spoke. Her name was Sarah Donnelly. She kept goats on a south-facing slope where the snow melted faster and the wind cut harder. James found her standing at the gate, posture straight, hands resting on weathered wood, white hair braided down her back and tucked beneath a knit cap pulled low. Her eyes were pale and sharp, the kind that missed little and forgot nothing. "They broke the gate first," she said, calm and exact, voice carrying the rhythm of someone used to being believed only by herself. "Clean break. Too clean." She described a truck that did not belong, men who smiled too easily, an offer made and refused with courtesy that did not last. James wrote it down without interruption, nodding once when she finished. "Thank you," he said, an emotional microline offered without embellishment. Paperwork followed, statements, photographs, reports filed and cross-referenced, each page added to a growing stack that did not look impressive but felt solid in the hand. No single piece told the story. Together, they began to suggest shape. A name surfaced again and again, never directly connected, never present at the point of contact, but always close enough to leave fingerprints on the edges. Caleb Rourke. He did not appear in the snow. He did not leave boot prints or tire tracks. His influence showed up in shell companies, in subcontractors who asked questions that were not theirs to ask, in offers that arrived friendly and left sour. James circled the name without touching it, building a perimeter of fact that would hold when pressure came. Back at the cabin, the night stretched long. Shadow lay near the hearth, bandaged and still, breath coming slow and shallow, each rise of his chest a small victory measured in seconds. His coat had been cleaned, the dark sable dulled by antiseptic and care, scars standing out more clearly now that blood no longer hid them. His eyes opened when Jonas entered the room, tracking him with effort, tail shifting once against the floor in a faint acknowledgement. Jonas sat beside him through the dark hours, one hand resting on the dog's shoulder where the fur grew back unevenly. He did not speak much. When he did, it was in low murmurs, meant only for the space between them. "Easy," he said once, a human canine connection line placed carefully, like a hand on a wound. "I'm here." The fire crackled softly, casting light that rose and fell with the wind outside. Jonas listened to Shadow's breathing, learned its rhythm, counted each pause without letting fear take shape. His thoughts stayed with what James was doing, with the slow assembly of truth that required patience he had learned long ago, patience that had once kept him alive. He did not pray for revenge, he prayed for truth to stand. Days passed, snow receded into mud along the roads, the clean white replaced by brown and gray that clung to boots and tires. Tracks became harder to read, edges blurred by thaw and traffic, urgency pressing in as evidence threatened to dissolve into ordinary wear. James worked faster without rushing, adjusting to the season's change, documenting what could still be preserved before it vanished. He returned to the cabin one afternoon, boots leaving dark prints on the porch boards. Shadow lifted his head, ears twitching, eyes alert despite the pain that still held his body. James paused at the door, acknowledging the dog with a brief nod before stepping inside. "We're close," he said quietly, an emotional microline offered without promise. "But close isn't enough yet." Jonas met his gaze and nodded. He understood the difference. That night, the wind picked up again, rattling the eaves and carrying the distant sound of engines along the road below. Jonas did not move from his chair. Shadow's body tensed, then settled as Jonas's hand pressed gently against his shoulder, grounding him in the present. Outside, the mountain waited. Somewhere, paperwork lay unfinished. Somewhere, a name remained just out of reach, protected by distance and habit, and the belief that patience would run out before consequences arrived. James Miller continued to build his case one piece at a time, knowing that truth rarely arrived fully formed. It needed voices, not anger, not noise, just one more voice willing to speak. The last piece arrived without drama, no sirens, no confrontation, just a knock that did not rush and a voice that sounded tired before it sounded afraid. James Miller met the man in a borrowed office near the edge of town, the kind of place that smelled faintly of dust and old paper, where nothing important ever seemed to happen. The light there was flat, unforgiving, revealing every line in a face that had carried too much for too long. The man was a subcontractor, mid-40s, hands rough from work that paid by completion, not by comfort. His jacket was clean but worn thin at the elbows, his eyes restless in the way of someone who had learned to scan rooms long before he learned to speak freely. He did not sit at first. He stood, weight shifting from foot to foot, jaw working as if testing words he had already decided not to trust. He did not break because of fear. He broke because of exhaustion. Weeks of silence had settled into his shoulders, heavier than any threat. Carrying a lie day after day had bruised him in places fists never reached, and the effort of pretending nothing was wrong had begun to cost more than telling the truth ever could. When he finally spoke, his voice did not shake. It dropped, steady and flat, as if letting go of something he no longer had the strength to hold. James listened without interrupting. He asked for details, not tone. Names, not opinions. Timelines, not feelings. The man answered slowly, carefully, as if placing each word where it could not be taken back. He spoke of instructions that came indirectly, payments that passed through hands that never stayed the same, jobs that asked for pressure rather than presence. He did not say Caleb Rourke's name at first. He did not have to. The shape of the story curved toward it on its own. When the last detail settled, James closed the folder and laid it flat on the table. No ceremony, no flourish. "Enough," he said. It was an emergency action dialogue delivered without volume, the kind that ended things rather than started them. The man exhaled once, a long breath that emptied more than his lungs, and nodded as if a weight had finally found the ground. Outside, the town went on with its afternoon, unaware that something had shifted. That night, The mountain held its silence differently. A set of headlights slowed on the road below the cabin, lingering longer than they should have, the beams cutting pale arcs through melting snow and mud. Jonas noticed them from the window. The way he noticed all changes now, without alarm but without dismissal. The lights paused, engine idling, as if measuring distance, as if confirming a location already known. Then they moved on. Not hurried, not casual, just gone. James's people were watching now, quietly, from places that did not announce themselves. The road no longer belonged solely to those who had used it before. The shift was subtle, but it was there, felt more than seen, like pressure easing in the chest after a long hold. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low. Shadow lay near the hearth, bandages clean, breath steady in a slow rhythm that filled the room with sounds softer than silence. His coat had lost its shine, dulled by injury and care, but the lines of his body still spoke of strength waiting its turn. When the headlights faded, his ears twitched once, then settled. He shifted slightly, adjusting his weight, and his tail touched the floor in a single deliberate tap. It was not much, it was everything. Jonas had been sitting without moving, hands clasped loosely, eyes on the dark window, listening to the world beyond it. When Shadow's tail moved, Jonas felt something loosen inside him that had been held tight for years. He exhaled slowly, a breath he had been holding so long he had forgotten it was there, the sound barely audible but deeply human. The miracle was not an arrest warrant. It was not paperwork signed or doors knocked down. The miracle was trust returning in the smallest possible motion, a dog choosing to acknowledge the night without bracing for pain. Shadow did not lift his head. He did not rise. He simply remained where he was, unafraid enough to move, unafraid enough to rest. Jonas reached out and let his hand settle against Shadow's shoulder, fingers resting lightly where scars interrupted fur. A human K9 connection line followed, spoken low, meant only for the space they shared. "Easy," he murmured. "You're safe." Shadow's breathing did not change. That, too, was a kind of answer. James arrived later, his boots leaving quiet marks on the porch boards, his presence announced by the door opening slowly, deliberately. He did not bring news that demanded celebration. He brought confirmation. The last piece had fit. The shape was complete enough now to stand on its own. "We're moving," he said, an emotional microline offered without promise of speed. "No noise." Jonas nodded. He did not ask how long. He understood the difference between fast and right. Outside, the snow had given way to mud, the ground soft and unforgiving, tracks blurring as quickly as they appeared. The season was changing, and with it, the window for clean evidence narrowed. James's team adjusted, shifting routes, watching from angles that did not look like watching. The men who had once believed themselves unseen began to sense something else, something patient and persistent, moving just beyond their awareness. They were being observed now. Not followed. Observed. The difference mattered. The nights grew quieter again, not because danger had vanished, but because it had been contained. Engines passed without slowing. Voices carried no farther than they needed to. The cabin stood where it always had, unchanged, unremarkable, a place the mountain seemed willing to keep. Shadow slept more deeply as days passed, pain receding in careful increments, strength returning in slow, measured ways. His eyes followed Jonas when he moved, but they no longer tracked every shadow beyond the walls. When the wind rose, he listened, then settled, trusting the silence to hold. Jonas watched this with a patience born of gratitude rather than vigilance. He had once believed that miracles arrived loudly, marked by sudden reversals and unmistakable signs. Standing there in the dim light, hand resting on a scarred shoulder, he understood the truth differently. Miracles came quietly, through endurance, through restraint, through the willingness of truth to wait until it could no longer be denied. James stood by the door for a moment before leaving, looking out into the dark where the road curved away. "It won't be dramatic," he said, almost as an apology. Jonas shook his head. "That's fine." The law would arrive the way it always did when it worked best, without spectacle, without warning, guided by facts that refused to be ignored. No sirens would announce it, no shouting would precede it, just doors opened at the right time, papers served in the right order, and consequences unfolding the way gravity did when no one interfered. As James left, the cabin settled back into its quiet rhythm. The fire snapped softly. The wind moved around the eaves and passed on. Shadow shifted again, this time pressing his side more firmly against the warmth, eyes closing fully for the first time since the night everything changed. Jonas remained where he was, listening to the steady sound of breath, feeling the mountain's weight ease just enough to be noticed. Justice was coming. It did not need a siren. Dawn arrived without announcement. The sky lightened slowly, not with color, but with permission, the way mornings did when the world had decided to keep going, regardless of what had happened in the dark. The road below town held no sirens, no urgency, only the sound of tires meeting pavement at a careful speed. This was not a chase. It was an ending that understood its own weight. Caleb Rourke stood in his clean shoes when the truth reached him. The room he occupied was orderly, deliberate, the kind of space meant to project control. His coat was pressed, his hair set, his hands steady on the table as papers were placed in front of him. He did not raise his voice, he did not resist. The moment did not ask for spectacle. It asked for acknowledgement, and in that quiet exchange, the distance he had kept between himself and consequence finally closed. There were no words worth remembering. At the same hour, miles away, Jonas Hale remained where he belonged. The cabin was warm. The fire burned low and steady, its light moving gently across the walls like a memory that no longer hurt. Shadow lay near the hearth, wrapped in clean bandages, his body still marked by what had been done but no longer defined by it. His breathing was even, deliberate, the slow rhythm of a life that had been spared because someone refused to let cruelty be the final voice. Jonas sat nearby, hands resting loosely on his knees, listening. He did not know the exact moment the warrant was served. He did not need to. The mountain carried its own signals now, subtle shifts in air and sound that spoke of balance returning. Outside, the snow had begun its retreat, melting into the ground in quiet surrender, leaving behind dark earth and the promise of what waited beneath. Days passed, then weeks. The world softened. Snow pulled back from the slopes, revealing grass that came in thin and pale at first, fragile in appearance but stubborn in will. The wind lost its edge, the nights lengthened and warmed, no longer pressing against the windows with the same intent. The cabin breathed differently, no longer holding its breath. Shadow healed the way he always had, slowly, honestly, without drama. At first, his movements were careful, measured, each shift of weight considered before it was trusted. Jonas never rushed him. He watched instead, attentive without hovering, offering presence rather than command. Their connection had never needed instruction. It had always lived in timing. One morning the light came in low through the window, catching dust in the air and turning it gold. Jonas was at the table when he heard it, the faint scrape of claws against wood, a sound so small it could have been missed. Shadow was standing, not fully steady, not without effort. He swayed once, adjusted, then held. The moment stretched. Jonas did not move. He did not speak. He simply watched, allowing the choice to belong to the dog. Shadow took a step, uncertain but determined, then another. His body remembered what it meant to move forward, even when the ground was unfamiliar. Jonas rose slowly and placed a hand on Shadow's shoulder. Not to stop him, not to guide him, to allow. A human canine connection line followed, barely above breath. "Take your time." Shadow did not look back. He did not need to. He moved toward the door, drawn by something older than pain, older than fear. Outside, the mountain waited, no longer hostile, no longer demanding proof of strength. It simply existed, vast and patient. They stood together on the porch. The view had not changed. The peaks still rose sharp against the sky. The valleys still held shadow where the sun had not yet reached. But the way Jonas saw it had shifted. The mountains no longer felt like a place to hide. They felt like witnesses, quiet and enduring. Peace did not arrive with sound. It stayed. It settled into the spaces that had once been held by vigilance and grief. It lived in the routine of mornings that no longer began with scanning for threat. It rested in evenings where the fire burned without purpose beyond warmth. It existed in the simple fact of companionship, unburdened by expectation. James Miller came by once, weeks later. He did not bring updates. He brought closure, the kind that did not ask to be celebrated. He stood on the porch, hat in hand, eyes taking in the quiet with respect. "It's done," he said, an emotional microline offered without pride. Jonas nodded. That was enough. They did not speak of the past. They spoke instead of weather, of roads reopening, of how the town seemed lighter now, though no one could quite say why. James looked at Shadow, standing nearby, stronger now, eyes clear. "Good dog," he said softly. Shadow's tail moved once. After James left, the days continued their gentle progression. People drove past the cabin again, slower than before, not out of curiosity but acknowledgement, a nod, a wave. The small language of a place that understood what had been endured. Jonas found himself doing things he had not done in years, repairing a fence not because it was necessary, but because it pleased him to see it whole, sitting outside in the evening without counting shadows, allowing silence to be just silence. Shadow resumed his place at Jonas's side, not as a guard, not as a shield, but as a companion who had earned the right to rest. Loyalty, once a weapon sharpened by necessity, softened into something else entirely. A blessing. On a clear afternoon, they walked together to the edge of the clearing. Shadow moved with confidence now, his gait uneven but purposeful, each step an affirmation rather than a test. Jonas matched his pace, neither leading nor following, simply present. They stopped where the land dropped away, giving view to the long sweep of valley below. The air was warm, the grass bent under the breeze. Somewhere far off, a bird called, unafraid. Jonas rested his hand on Shadow's shoulder again, not to hold on, but to share. In that quiet, there was no need to remember what had been taken. What remained was enough. Endurance, trust, the understanding that justice, when it came without cruelty, left room for healing rather than hunger. The mountain watched them. It always would. The mountain grows quiet again. Not the kind of silence that follows fear, but the kind that comes after something has finally been set down. Some stories do not end with cheers or noise. They end with a steady breath, with the dog resting by the fire, with a man no longer scanning the dark for what might come next. Loyalty, when you see it up close, is rarely loud. It shows itself in waiting, in staying, in choosing to stand between what is fragile and what would harm it, even when no one is watching. Courage does not always rush forward. Sometimes it simply refuses to leave. It endures the long nights. It trusts again, one careful step at a time. And kindness, the truest kind, does not ask to be remembered. It works quietly, through hands that heal, through voices that choose truth, through lives that protect without applause. There are men and women like this everywhere, living ordinary days, carrying extraordinary resolve, holding the world together in ways most of us will never see. If this story leaves you with a pause in your chest, let it stay there for a moment. That quiet is not emptiness, it is hope. Not every hero wears a badge, and not every story makes the headlines. Here at Shadow K9 Unit, we keep their courage alive. Subscribe today so you'll never miss the next untold story of officers and their K9 partners.